Good morning. My name is Andrew Lewin. I'm the Member of Parliament for Welwyn Hatfield. Welcome to everyone joining us today for our evidence session of the UK Trade and Business Commission, which I have the privilege to chair. It's our second of these sessions that we're holding this year. And we have a fantastic lineup of people to talk about how we navigate the next phase of the UK-EU relationship. And we're meeting in a context where we are just under a month away from the UK-EU summit, which has been confirmed for the 19th of May, and perhaps one of the most significant moments in our relationship since the trade and cooperation agreement was signed and the UK left the European Union back at the end of 2020. As always, I am very pleased to be joined by the commissioners of the UK Trade and Business Commission. They are colleagues from the world of business, politics. Many have served as civil servants, and they will be asking the questions today of our three guests, who I will start by introducing. So first of all, we have Philip Rycroft joining us today. Philip is the former permanent secretary to the Department for Exiting the European Union and had 30 years of experience in the civil service. We're very pleased to be joined by him. We have Miguel Berger, who is the German ambassador to the United Kingdom. An exceptionally busy time for you, Miguel, over the last few months, I'm sure. So really, really grateful that you are joining us today. And finally, last but certainly not least, we have Evie Aspinall, who is the director of the British Foreign Policy Group. We have an hour and a half to ask a host of questions. And I am going to kick us off by inviting Iman to open with the first question.
Thank you very much, Andrew, and thank you also for all of you for having the time to come today. I will start the first question to the Ambassador Herr Berger. What would you say is the EU's success measure for an improved UK-EU relationship? And maybe I will also ask the questions for the other panelists. My next question would be to Philip. What would you say is the UK government's vision for an improved UK-EU relations? And maybe, Evie, if you think that there are any global impact from all of this discussion currently happening, please do contribute as well. Thank you.
Yeah, so thank you very much. If I may start with that, Andrew and members of the Commission, for inviting me to this hearing, to this discussion. And yeah, what is the measure of success? I would say that the context in which this Reset Summit will take place has obviously changed considerably in the last 3 months. We are I would say, jointly in a very difficult geopolitical situation. We have the decisions on tariffs, which were taken by the US administration. We are maybe in the decisive phase of talks on a possible end to Russia's war against Ukraine. And I think in this geopolitical context, there is a very high expectation also, I would say, in our public opinion among politicians, that the United Kingdom and the European Union have to work closer together. So if I look at the broad range of topics which will be on the agenda on the 19th of May, I would say that the expectation is that we move forward on the cooperation on security and defense. And the decisions which were taken in the European Union, but also nationally with the new German government, to invest massively in industrial defense capacities, to strengthen our interoperability, to do more jointly within NATO. The expectation is that we come forward with a security and defense agreement between the United Kingdom and the European Union. But besides that, we have a lot of other topics which I can with pleasure go into them. But I think this is the main point. But let me add one issue. that as a result of Brexit, obviously, we have lost a lot on trade, on mobility, especially also for young people, but also for professionals, for skilled labor. And I think that we need to see progress also in these areas.
Thank you, Herr Berger. Philip?
Yeah, so your question was, what would you say the UK government's vision for the improved UK-EU relationship is? I'd have to say, in some respects, that's still, to my mind, not entirely clear. In a way, you probably wouldn't be asking me the question if it was crystal clear what that vision was. And when the government came into power, it clearly did so with an intention, a commitment to improve the relationship, which had been, as we all know, in the doldrums for a long time. And it set about that, I think, with good intent and good earnest. However, in opposition in the course of the election campaign, and then when it came into power, the Labour Party had spent quite a lot of time emphasising all the things it wouldn't do, like rejoin the single market, rejoin the customs union, rejecting freedom of movement. And those red lines clearly are still in place. But as the ambassador has said, things have changed hugely over the last 3 months or so. I think it's very difficult to overstate the extent to which the geopolitical context in which we are all now living has altered significantly, and that clock can't be turned back easily. So that, as an imperative to drive UK policy in terms of its relationship with the EU, is hugely important. But there is another great imperative as well, which underpins so much else of what the Labour government is doing, which is the quest for growth. The UK economy, which has been sluggish for a number of years, clearly not helped by Brexit. We don't need to go into all the stats there. I'm sure you as a commission are very familiar with those stats. What are the sources of growth? How do we get growth back into the UK economy while addressing some of the things that Brexit has done to hobble the UK economy? Clearly, that makes a lot of sense. So I think there will be, and I expect to see over the next little while in the run-up and to the summit itself, there will be movement, particularly, again, as the ambassador has said, on the defence foreign policy side of things. And there will be movement on the trade side as well. But the big question, which I'll sort of leave hanging for now, is how much further down that track the government is prepared to go in terms of addressing some of the issues that have emerged from Brexit in terms of our trading relationship with the EU. That, I think, is a big question which remains at this point unanswered.
Thanks, Philip. Very interesting. Evie, any comments from your side?
Yes, I just wanted to touch on kind of this wider kind of global development and how this sits within it. And I think, as the others have touched on, we've seen these kind of big shifts, both kind of the rise of conflict with Ukraine and the Middle East, and then events in the United States in the last couple of months. We're seeing a reformulation of the multilateral world order, which is kind of crumbling around us, and understanding then that kind of while we have these imperatives that are pushing the UK and the EU closer together, they're also reforging other relationships as well. And across the world, you're seeing nations looking for stable partnerships, friendshoring and onshoring. And these are the wider trends that we're seeing, which are, and it will also impact how the UK and the EU want to work together. It increases the imperative too, but it also, there are new opportunities for both the UK and the EU to be finding other partners as well at this point in time. And there will always be trade-offs and balances for us to be thinking about, particularly when it comes to trade at the moment. So I think that's kind of key thing to keep in mind as we go through this. I agree that we're moving, defense is the area where there is the most imperative and also kind of the most movement at the moment. But hopefully we'll see some progress on trade and other areas too in the coming months.
Thanks, Evie. Thanks to all witnesses.
Thank you, Evie. I'm going to abuse the chair's privilege to ask a quick follow-up because you used a term which I've not come across before, which is friend shoring. Can you tell us a little bit more about what you mean by friend shoring?
Absolutely. So it's basically the idea that, nations that we're less comfortable with or we aren't, as close to, we avoid having supply chain reliance on some of those and we move them closer to allies and people that we really trust. Now, traditionally, perhaps the UK would friendshore towards the United States. That feels like a reliable partner. And we're seeing some of the challenges then with friendshoring because your friends aren't always the most reliable. But for example, the UK and the EU, despite some of its challenges in recent history, would see themselves as kind of close alliances and friends. And therefore, that creates the impetus to kind of move closer together. You're seeing the same if you look towards ASEAN. Lots of ASEAN countries are working more closely together, looking slightly inwards, looking more towards the kind of regional partners as an opportunity to kind of strengthen those relationships with people that they trust.
Excellent, thank you. Claire, we have the next question from you, please.
Sure. Hi there. My name is Claire Hanna. I'm MP for South Belfast. And I suppose thinking specifically of trade and taking the various red lines into account, I wanted to ask how the summit can meaningfully deepen EU and UK trade relations and how quickly you think progress might be able to be made in the negotiations to follow. I might start with you, Ambassador Berger.
Yes, Claire, no, with pleasure. I think it's very important to make a distinction between the reset we are having now and the summit, where we will have some kind of a joint declaration, a communique, which will lay out the areas we will work in. And because the word of friendshoring came, today is an energy security summit in London. And I think energy is a very good example of trying to find solutions for our energy security and safety in our neighborhood and not far away. So I would say the 19th of May, the summit, is the starting point for negotiations. And the communique will lay out the different areas: energy, very important, fishery, agri-food, SPS agreement. So many, many things, youth mobility, hopefully also students, other topics. Then a negotiation process will start. But independently from that, I think it is very important that the review of the trade and cooperation agreement, which comes next year, is a process which is politically connected, but it's a different process. And there we haven't even started to look at possible topics for a review. And I'm sure that this debate will start in the second half of this year. So the red lines, obviously, as EU member states, the German government, we obviously accept the red lines as they were defined. And in the end, for us, it's the question of what the British government, the level of ambition of the British government. If the British government would like to move further, then we are open to discuss that. But I think let's start with what is on the table. These are very substantial points. And my hope is that once we move forward on these issues and these topics, we will create, hopefully, a dynamic of cooperation, which will then allow us maybe to go further than what is currently on the table. And we all have spoken about the geopolitical context, which makes it all the more important that the European Union, the United Kingdom, the wider Europe, I would say, cooperates jointly as much as possible.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Philip, you rightly, I suppose, placed a question mark over exactly this in your last answer that remains to be seen. But could you share with us where you think that is and what you think the pace is going to be?
Yeah, so the ambassador's outlined the main sort of subjects for discussion. These have been in the sort of public domain for a long time now. I think the mood music, as far as one can see, is relatively positive around these things, which is all to the good. These are significant domains for the sectors involved doing a veterinary deal which would reduce or eliminate the checks at the border. Hugely significant for the industry as a whole, but really important, obviously, from a Northern Ireland perspective in terms of the Northern Ireland Protocol. These are big, important things. And the energy, doing an emissions trading deal, improving energy connection between the UK and the EU. Again, in terms of energy security, just a sensible running of an energy market. These will be very beneficial ultimately to consumers as well. But in the grand scheme of things, of course, this will improve the trading relationship, but we will not undo that 4% of GDP damage that is widely seen as the cost of the trade and cooperation agreement compared to what we had when we were in the single market. It is also worth remembering, and the Commission must be aware of these things, that the sorts of changes that are proposed, the deals that are proposed, will come at some political cost in the UK context. We already have the Fisher folk kicking up about the possibility of a rollover of the deal that was done in the TCA. They didn't think that was a brilliant deal, so extending that for another 2-3 years clearly is not going to please the UK fishing industry. If we do a deal on SPS, sanitary phytosanitary veterinary, what the indications are, that's likely to be dynamic alignment. I think the Commission will well understand what that means. That means the UK essentially taking on pretty much all of the laws, the changes, the regulations that come out of Brussels in that sector. And, you know, there are a lot of them in that particular domain. They change a lot. That would mean the UK Parliament passing an awful lot of secondary legislation over which it has had very limited influence in order to incorporate those regulations into UK law. This will be tough. And in a way, the job the government has, it seems to me, is preparing the UK public for these sorts of trade-offs. And this is the uncomfortable position that we've been put in by Brexit. There's no running away from that, and there's no easy path out of that. So that, I think, is something to consider. Now, beyond that, I'm sure that, as the ambassador said, we look forward to the review of the TCA next year. There are other domains which should be fruitful for improved cooperation. For example, mutual recognition of conformity assessment, very important. It's quite technical, but very important for an awful lot of industries. Mutual recognition of professional qualifications, these things matter. But the big question, I think the really interesting one, is what space is there for a relationship that could develop over the next 5-10 years that sits somewhere between full membership of the single market and what we have now in the TCA. And that, it seems to me, is unexplored territory. And we haven't had that debate yet, either in the UK or in the EU, as to whether there is a different sort of relationship, perhaps not precedented, that would recognise the scale importance of the UK as a European country. The fact we're not going to get back into the EU, I don't think, anytime soon, but we have this hugely important trading, defence, security relationship with our near abroad. That, I think, is the big outstanding question, and that's not going to be answered in the next couple of weeks.
I might just ask 2 wee follow-ups, if you don't mind, just slightly expanding on your point. You said it won't bridge the gap, the sort of the 4% perceived hit of the TCA. Do you have a specific, do you have some figures in mind, or how do you think it might bridge that? And secondly, the legislative, I suppose, needs, I'm sure Best for Britain would have very good research to demonstrate that the public are very largely in the right place for this. And I suppose the government will just be catching up with public opinion. But I appreciate that the sort of depth of conversation hadn't been had. I suppose how onerous will that be? There's not a one and done Henry VIII type power approach that could be done to facilitate dynamic alignment.
I two very good questions. There is clearly not yet an impact assessment done by the UK government on on the deal that might be done over time. So I don't have numbers about what the compared to the 4% GDP loss of how much of that might be mitigated by the sort of deal we're contemplating. We know, for example, for the food sector that we might see the reduction in costs of probably several hundred million. There's a difference of view between the government and the industry about how much all of these checks on UK exports actually cost the industry, but it is in the hundreds of million. And with a better deal, that might also see an increase in exports. And I've seen a figure of £2 billion worth of more exports on the food side. So you're talking significant numbers, but 4% of GDP is a lot more than that. So it is closing the gap, but it's not going to take us anywhere near that 4% of GDP, but it's in the right direction of travel. I don't want to underestimate the importance of setting off down this track. On public opinion, of course, you're right. The opinion polls have been steady for a long time now in terms of both people believing that Brexit has not delivered benefit, but also support for ultimately rejoining the EU. And that's fine, and that's important, and there's a big demographic effect in all of that, and that young folk more inclined to support rejoining the EU. But in the abstract, that works very well. But the point about the way in which the UK Parliament would have to deal with these issues, these are not in the abstract. These are very specific, and you would have some very vociferous interests opposing what the UK government is seeking to do, for example, on fishing, and that generates political debate and noise, and that will make people sit up and think, and that is going to have to be managed. And I don't need to tell you that in terms of folk looking for points of opposition on this journey, there are plenty of politicians who will seize on any opportunity to make a fuss in terms of what they see as a reneging on the Brexit progress. So this will be politically hard fought, and it'll be noisy, and we're going to have to get used to that.
Sure. I mean, I've spent every day of the last decade, I think, talking about Brexit, so I would concur. Although I think while there's a mine for grievances there, I think there isn't a compelling counter argument. Evie, I might pick up with you on the same questions. How quickly, how much do you think this can progress? And if possible, you might comment as well about whether or not an ambitious SPS arrangement would mitigate those checks between Britain and Northern Ireland.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think with anything, progress is always slower than you would like. And I think this will be kind of the epitome of that. As Miguel touched on, we expect the summit to lay out a plan as a starting point for negotiations. I think the thing we'd really like to see is kind of the concrete timelines and plans. Because, so far, we've had this reset of the relationship, and it's being characterized by lots of warm words, but it's what's next, what comes after that, and what's the kind of concrete plan and way forward. Not least because that provides opportunities to interrogate that, think about that more constructively, and work out kind of collectively where our red lines are and how we move forwards. I just wanted to touch on the question around kind of public opinion, and I'm stealing my lunch from some of the later questions, so I might regret this. But like Best Britain, we do quite a bit of work on public opinion and foreign policy, and I think it's worth noting that while absolutely we've seen a real shift in public perspectives on the EU, we're at a point where across the board there's pretty broad support for closer collaboration. I think. And even that comes across from Leave voters, Reform voters, etc. There are specific issues, migration being probably the number one, and fishing rights perhaps the second, where people get very animated and where I think it has the potential to become quite a toxic debate. And I think if I was the government, I would be having those two kind of conversations in my head of those are the red lines for the public. What can we do within those parameters? And I think that's why defence has and will continue to be a useful starting point. in the UK, while there are particularly large swathes of young people that are very anti-defence and defence spending, broadly it's kind of widely recognised that we need to increase defence spending and we need to have cooperation with key partners. So it's relatively uncontroversial and a good starting point and a way in. The question then is how much engagement do the British public actually want? And when it comes to it and it says, okay, well, you've got to, give the EU access to UK fisheries, etc., how toxic does that debate become? And I think that's still in some ways an unknown, but one that I think if I was government, I'd be particularly nervous about at this point in time. I'm conscious Simon has his hands up, so I'll stop talking for now.
Thank you very much. I'll hand back to you, Chair. Thank you for all those answers.
Thank you, Claire. And Simon, please do jump in.
Andrew, thank you very much. In the context of the comment that there is obviously potentially looking less by the UK government, but more from the EU for a space between our current arrangement between us and one which might be developed, I wonder if I could ask the Ambassador what his senses the mood is in the European Union countries. We've got a new European Parliament, we have a new European Commission, relatively new, we're about to have a new German government. We have an Italian government that's likely to be around for a while. Obviously, it's slight uncertainty in France. Is there a sense that there could be a particular relationship with the UK that would be different and better and closer than anywhere else in Europe, given there's EFTA on one side, applicant countries in another position? So really just to have a catch-up, Ambassador, on what your perception is among colleagues and friends in the European Union.
Yeah, no, my perception is very clearly that there is a strong interest in having this close relationship with the United Kingdom. And as I described at the beginning, with all the geopolitical challenges we have around us, our common interest, for example, in finding a solution on the US tariffs, but also Russia's aggression, the way how we deal with China, I think all of that speaks in favor of cooperating very closely and as countries, as friends, allies with the same democratic values. I think there is an absolute need to cooperate. And I can say in Germany, cross-party support for a closer relationship with the United Kingdom.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Andrew.
Thank you, Simon. Okay, so I had the next question. Ambassador, you've already talked about the geopolitical changed context and the real emphasis on defence and security that we expect at the summit in the next month. My question for all of you on the panel today is, how do we balance the, in my view, right focus on defence, given the climate that we're in, but make sure that the trade element of the reset is still prominent, and can the two be sort of mutually supportive?
Yeah, maybe if I answer this a little bit in a broader way. So from the side of the European Union, what is crucial for us also in Germany is, number one, that we see the progress in the implementation of the agreements we already have. And let me really underline how important the Windsor framework has been under the then Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, in order to, depoliticize and take away many tensions that we had around the implementation of the Northern Ireland Protocol. But, beyond that, it also helped to develop a more pragmatic relationship. And what we have seen under the Labour government is that this has continued. I must say, I personally would have liked to see this summit earlier. So we are now, May will be, I think, the 10th month of the Labour government. But things are as they are, and now we have to see how we can move forward. I would say, from the European point of view, what we are looking for is a kind of package approach. So that means that the different topics, they are interconnected somehow. So we can't solve only energy or only defense without making progress on the other topics. And I'm sure the British government has a very similar approach to these negotiations, especially because there are some topics, as was mentioned, which might be a little bit more sensitive in one country or in another country. And that's why we need to find a balanced approach on the way forward. If you look at the substance, some of the topics can be solved easier and faster than others. But at the end, and that is also my expectation for the summit, that we will get a communique which will lay out the path for the negotiations and hopefully also an understanding on the timeline. I think that the majority of the topics, it should be possible to solve them during this year, in 2025, because then next year we will focus then on the review of the trade and cooperation agreement. But again, number one, implementation of existing agreements, and number two, really that this is a package approach where we will have a give and take on the different areas. And because it was mentioned, let me also really say that this agri-food agreement, SPS veterinary, very technical, many, as Philip has said, many technical regulations on SPS. This is something where we can show to our public opinion that the agreements we might do will help also to reduce prices in the supermarket. So I think this is the message we need also to send to consumers. Governments need to send to their voters that even if agriculture is only 0.3% of our trade, this is something that is important for voters, it's important for the people, and this is something that we can also then show. And if we speak about fishery, yes, it's about quota and access to waters, but it's also very important to underline that more than 70% of the fish which comes from British fishery is sold in the European market. So it's a give and take. It's a relationship which is very, very close, and where we will find a way that will be acceptable to both sides.
Thank you. Philip, I was keen to come to you next. You obviously have extensive experience of trade negotiations. Really keen for your perspective on how that sort of interlinks with the current focus on defence as well.
Yeah, of course there are linkages. There will always be linkages. There's linkages in every trade negotiation. When the UK was a member of the EU, there was constant linkages being made all the time, just not quite as visibly as they are now that we're a third country. Clearly, you're into this sort of negotiation. The give and take of the negotiation becomes a lot more visible to the British public, which is one of the things we've been discussing about how the government sort of seeks to manage that public opinion. I think the ambassador again is absolutely right. There will be a package here. That's the way that you get things moving forward, which are more or less palatable to either side in the negotiation. The trick, of course, is not to overface the negotiation, to try and put too much into a package. So to be ambitious but not over ambitious, and that's the trick of the diplomacy in all of this. And no doubt the Sherpas have been working very hard to try and get that right balance. And there is an education job to be done here. I mean, there has been quite a lot of humptiness about the way the perception that the French have linked defence and fisheries, and how could they, when defence is like literally existentially important. Fisheries is this important in the grand scheme of things, relatively small industry. How could they do that? But of course they're going to do that because there's an opportunity to do it, to look after their interests, the interests of their fishing fleet. So those linkages will be made, and we've got to get used to that from the UK perspective. And the way that the government sets out its potential negotiating position in advance becomes really, really important. And it's just worth mentioning in this respect the whole question of youth mobility. Youth mobility has always been clear as a big ask from the EU side. We should be really flattered by that, actually, as a UK, that all these youngsters from the EU want to come to the UK to study, to work, to visit, to learn the language and the rest of it. And the government been sort of rejecting that initially. You go back a few months, some really quite hard language about this not being compatible with our ambitions around migration and so on. I thought that was a tactical mistake because it meant that if we do a deal, and I hope we do, on youth mobility, there will be accusations of a climb down. So there is something in all of this about the UK side, now we're outside of the EU, learning how to manage these multi-dimensional negotiations where you are going to deal with a package that's give and take, and the way that the road to that is prepared and laid out, and then the way in which the deal is sold. Again, as the ambassador has said, selling this deal, there's going to be lots of very positive elements in it, but we need to get used to thinking through how we present the UK negotiating position in the run-up and through and in the aftermath of these sorts of negotiations.
Excellent, thank you so much, Philip. And Evie, last question from me is to you. With your sort of broader lens on foreign policy, particularly interested in your perspective in terms of how an UK-EU defence deal might be seen in Washington.
Yes, it's an interesting one, isn't it? And in many ways, I think it could be very positive in that, Trump is very keen to see the UK and Europe stepping up on defense and security and taking ownership for itself. So there's a real opportunity there. The flip side is the challenge that it's a combination that's kind of we're all wrangling with at the moment, is whether NATO, if you create external systems and structures, do you undermine the point of NATO, and do you make it easier for Trump to pull out of NATO? Now, I think it's probably all right, and I think actually in general it would be seen as a positive sign of Europe taking seriously the question around defense and security, but it is kind of a niggling kind of issue to think about at the same time. And also to think about kind of, for the UK, there's a risk in that, Trump is quite strongly supportive of the UK in relative terms of kind of Trump not really liking any of his allies that much. And so we also have to think about, but for the UK, any movement towards the EU, how does that affect how we can relate to the United States? It's more of a question when it comes to trade, and we're thinking about a UK-US trade deal, etc. And we'll all have our thoughts on whether we should be prioritizing the US or the EU, but it is worth thinking about that we are constantly making a decision between the two, and whilst we will be trying to balance the two as effectively as possible, there will be challenges along the way on that. I also just wanted to touch on the question of whether kind of defense and trade are mutually supportive when it comes to kind of UK-EU relations, because in some ways, yes, in that it helps build, in theory, mutual trust. It shows that it's possible for us to cooperate and collaborate together. But it is also worth noting that trade is a lot knottier in many ways than the questions around defense, which feel quite clearly mutually beneficial. On trade, there's lots of nitty-gritty questions that we have to dig into, and just being aware that that will slow the process down on defense and on other issues. And we may make the decision that that's worth it, and kind of having a clear package means you get more done, but it does mean the whole thing takes longer. And just being aware that the world is moving quickly and thinking about that fine balance between getting everything we want done and also at the same time moving quickly.
Thank you. Karma, I was keen to bring you in next, please.
Lovely. Thank you, Andrew. There's a lot of discussion there about the sort of multi-dimensional discussions and negotiations. So my question then is, do we have the right structures in place to support those discussions in the UK-EU relationship? What else might we need? What else do we need? And how can we ensure future resilience in any structures that are there and need to be set up? And perhaps I could start with Philip and Evie, and then perhaps Ambassador Berger, you could give us your perspective from your position. So Philip, can I pass that question to you?
Yes, thank you. I think my main comment on this is that structures are important, but political will is more important. Where there's a political will, there is generally a way. And the structures, in a sense, will follow in terms of putting in place the capability to deliver on that political will. So the the overarching importance of the commitment to the relationship, I think, is what we should be focusing on. I suspect we'll find that the structures set up around a TCA will prove in an era of a better relationship rather clunky, a bit too slow, as Evie has suggested, and that in the review of the TCA there will be an opportunity to revisit those structures to ensure that the connectivity, the agility of the officials on either side and politicians on either side to connect at the right moments to move things forward, that the structures support the intention for a better relationship. So I would expect that to come over the course of the next few months, more thought to be put into that. But no structures in the world can prove us again of a downturn in the quality of the relationship. So if there was a change of government, for example, in the UK, and a very different view of the relationship with the EU, the fact that we had improved structures would not guarantee that the relationship would stay where you or I might wish it to be. So as I say, structures are important. There is scope to improve them, I've no doubt, from what we have from the legacy of the TCA. But the key thing to keep focused on is the quality of the relationship and the political will that sits behind that.
Thank you, Philip. Evie, perhaps you'd like to comment further?
Yes, I mean, very much agree. Political will kind of is the key to any of the mechanisms working. I think currently a lot of the collaboration, partly because we've seen a shift in the UK's approach to the EU in the last kind of year and a bit predating this government as well. A lot of the mechanisms are quite slow, quite clunky. It's all quite ad hoc at the moment, and there's definitely scope for kind of formalizing those a bit, or even at the very least, like, you know, when we saw Lammy going to kind of key EU meetings, etc. Those kind of more ad hoc systems, but which are kind of really integrate the UK into some of those decision-making processes, even at least as an observer, so it knows what's going on, I think is a really valuable opportunity for us to kind of seize. I also think it's worth thinking about not just sort of state-to-state mechanisms, but also some of the subnational mechanisms. So city-to-city links, the role of organisations that are, you know, UK organisations being engaged in EU and European regulatory forums, such as accounting or building. These are really important also for getting that collaboration, mutual trust, and reducing barriers to trade, which actually often outlive kind of the political will and those kind of challenges at the top. Having those kind of more ad hoc, lower level subnational mechanisms, I think, is also really important.
Important point. Thank you, Evie. And Herberger, perhaps we could ask for your perspective.
Yes, thank you. No, very good points made by Philip and Evie, and I really agree with them that in the end, what is decisive is the political will to move forward. And as I said, this political will and interest is definitely there. As many of you here in this commission are members of parliament, I would also highlight the importance of the Parliamentary Assembly to discuss with the European Parliament the topics. And I would also like to see more parliamentary contacts between the select committees across a broad range of issues, including health, labor, things like that, where the exchange is much, much lower than anything we had before COVID. So I think there is room to develop a better relationship, but I also very much agree with Evie's point that it's very important that beyond the government-to-government contacts, which always will take place, and the parliamentarians, that we have the town twinnings, that we have the youth exchange, that we have school visits, everything that is the fabric of the personal relationship, language learning, exchange programs. We need to have the experience, and that's why for us, the so-called youth experience or youth mobility scheme is such an important point. And, because we think that especially young people need to have the opportunity to have the experience and to work and to live in our respective countries, because this is in the end the basis of our relationship. The basis of our relationship are personal contacts, personal experiences. And what we currently see is that we are losing here in the UK around 100 to 150,000 EU citizens are leaving every year. So we have a net negative migration since Brexit. And there are many obstacles people normally maybe don't think about. You need a passport to come here. Now you have this registration, which costs £16 for every tourist. We have very high thresholds for skilled labor to come here and to work. Visa costs are 10 times higher than in the European Union. So I think, beyond the political discussion and everything we are already doing, we need also to look at our civil society, at the personal contacts at all levels of our societies. This is, I think, a very important point for us in Germany, which I wanted to add.
Thank you, Ambassador. I'll hand back to Andrew.
Thank you, Karma. I was keen to bring in Stephen next, whose question I know was around youth mobility, so a timely moment to bring you in, Stephen.
That's right. Thank you, Andrew. And yes, I mean, my question, it's something we've touched on quite a lot in response to your own question 3, but it's obviously difficult for us as outsiders often to know what's going on. I think in the UK, it can depend whether you're reading the Financial Times or the Times or one of the other newspapers, but we keep hearing that there's pressure from a lot of quarters for linkage between what we'd see as unrelated issues. So whether that's fisheries and defence or whether it's youth mobility with food and drink. I mean, Philip kept coming back to fish. And of course, Ambassador, you yourself said that from the EU's point of view, it's really important to have a package approach to these things. But of course, is it possible really to ensure that all of these vital interests we're talking about are properly taken into account without this getting in the way really of progress on any of these issues? And maybe to start first with you, Ambassador, and then Philip and Evie.
Optimistic because of what we already discussed, the situation we are in, the challenges we are facing. I think everybody understands that we need to show also to our public opinion that we are able to deliver on especially on defense right now. We have the upcoming NATO summit in June, which will be a challenging summit. And I think it would be a very good step towards the NATO summit. We could show between the United Kingdom and the European Union that with a security and defense agreement, we do the right step on cooperation. Why is that important? Because the European Union has taken the decision not only to give member states more flexibility on their defense spending and their debt, because it will be debt-driven, but also to invest 150 billion. So this is a huge, huge amount. It's 3 times the MOD budget of the yearly budget. So this is a huge amount of money for the coming years. And we think that cooperation within Europe is absolutely essential. The other things, I'm very optimistic to your question that we will find a balanced approach on all of them. And I would not see a link between youth mobility, food and drink, not at all. But in general, I think we will work in all these areas towards common solutions. And there are so many things which will make a difference, like energy, the electricity market agreement, emission trading, carbon border adjustment mechanism. So many, many things which will have an impact on our economies. Not the big impact, as Philip has said, it will not change the 4% figure, but these will all be steps and elements in the right direction. And let me end by saying I'm really optimistic that our political leaders have understood the absolute importance of moving forward and sending this positive signal of cooperation right at this moment now.
And Philip, do you think we're putting too much on the table to be able to make progress anywhere, or is this approach inevitable?
No, I think the sort of package we got looks to me like a reasonable one. I have to say, I think there would be arguments to say you could have been more ambitious, less ambitious, take some stuff off, put more stuff on. But these are things that have to be navigated in the moment. Don't forget, it takes an awful lot of work to prepare for these things. The discussions on these various subjects have been going on for months already, and I think we'd know by now if it looked like there was any of these issues that would prove to be an absolute showstopper. And in a way, for the UK government, as it sort of learns the craft of how to negotiate improvements with in the relationship with the EU, now outside of the EU, this is a sort of learning we have to do post-Brexit. It's going to take time for us all to get used to that. There is actually substantial opportunity with this as the first major summit, because the external environment has changed so significantly. And as everybody is emphasizing, the importance of the defense deal, really that requires very little explanation. People will get that and understand that. And seeing how these other things alongside defense ultimately lead to an improvement in the relationship, which has consequential benefits for the British consumer in terms of food and drink, energy usage, and improved connectivity for young people. All of that, this can be sold as a very, very positive package for both the EU and the UK. And I think that momentum will help to get this over the line. Brilliant. If we get off to a good start with this, we get into the rhythm of these summits over time, we'll all get better at both the preparation of them, the ambition of them, and then the selling of them to the wider public.
And Evie, I'm starting, as a long-standing member of this commission, starting to feel a bit nervous about the optimistic tone of this discussion. Is that the right tone?
I feel like I'm more pessimistic, but that's more because maybe that's instinctive in me, or look too much public opinion. I think my main thought would be it's fine as long as the parameters are clear and they're clear from the start and we're all clear on them. I think the danger becomes when nations within the EU or the UK start adding in more and more things and their own individual demands, which is fairly feasible. And then you get a big, massive package, which is much harder to sell, I think, to the public, who then, those that are more instinctively nervous around the relationship with the EU will start to be like, well, the more comprehensive that package is, are we just renegotiating Brexit? Are you doing Brexit? Aren't doing Brexit by the back door? And so I think what we just have to be careful of is that there's a clear narrative as to why these things roughly fit together, which is, we're moving closer because the political and the economic environment has changed, and therefore it makes sense to be closer on defence and the economy, and that will improve UK national security and ultimately the money you have in your back pocket. And if that's the case and you can make that narrative compelling, I think there's support. But I think if we get too kind of broad and we just let everyone start adding things in, one, it gets really slow and difficult to negotiate. So there's a practical element, but two, there's a political element. So I think it's just a case of, from the start, being clear of what are we trying to achieve and sticking to it, and not letting everyone to kind of have their little own ad hoc additions as we go along. I think that's the key, but obviously easier said than done.
Thank you. And a very short supplementary question for the ambassador here, because you mentioned youth mobility again. And I think Philip was right in saying the UK actually should be proud of the fact that this is such a big issue to the rest of the EU. It's one of our strongest selling points. But we've seen reports that the UK wants any scheme to be limited to a year and further to be a cap. And of course, our question for you would, to the extent you can answer it, is do you believe anything like that, those limitations would be acceptable to the EU?
I think that we have to leave that to the negotiations. We have a mandate for the negotiations which asks for a 3-year period. I think that this is obviously then the starting point of our negotiations. But let me really say that I think it is such a positive thing that we work for the possibility of young people having this experience. And I always try to push back against the notion that this has anything to do with migration, because no, the young people would come here, stay a certain time, and then go home. So it has nothing to do with migration into the United Kingdom. And I can tell you that not only in Germany, but also in countries like Poland and others, the labor markets are very, very tight. So there is a lot of interest in attract these young people into our own labor force and economy, but we want them to have this experience and possibility. And the second thing is, because I always hear that this is a kind of freedom of movement through the back door. No, it is not, because it would be driven by visa. So it's not that anybody can decide, okay, tomorrow I want to do this youth exchange. No, it's a process, it's an application, it needs a visa, so it's a controlled process which has nothing to do with freedom of movement. So I think for me the important point is that we have a realistic debate of what it really means.
Thank you very much. And Andrew, back to you.
Thank you, Stephen. Tamara, keen to bring in you next.
Thank you, Chair. Just to echo what you said, Ambassador, before I come to you for my first question, as part of my work, I've mentored graduates from London fashion colleges and UK fashion colleges, and they've had to turn down placements at Paris fashion houses, which is so important for them to follow on from their graduation and go into hopefully creative directors. So I echo what you've said there. So leading into the first question to you, Ambassador, what is the role of EU member states in the UK-EU relationship, please?
Yeah, so we have a very clear distinction between the bilateral relationship and everything that is the competence of the European Commission. And so, for example, trade, or we have decided that the question of the youth mobility will be negotiated by the Commission for all member states. And what makes the process a little bit different is that here you have this structure in the Cabinet Office with Nick Thomas-Symonds as Minister and Parliamentary Undersecretary Michael Allen, and they work across the departments. In the European Union, the process is slower, it's more bureaucratic, because we need to give a mandate to the Commission for every single topic to be negotiated, which makes the process a bit slower, but it makes it also in a certain way transparent, because the whole discussion is taking place between the EU institutions and the member states. But this will not significantly slow down the process. But I think it's very important to recognize that there are these differences. And then we have obviously the European Parliament with their committees looking into the different areas of our cooperation. Plus, and that's why I mentioned it before, the importance of the parliamentary and civil society contacts.
Thank you. And then to Philip, what should the role of the devolved governments in the UK be towards this?
Thank you for that question. This is hugely important. I have a personal interest in this, as I talk to you from up a hill in Dumfriesshire, where my home is. It's easy to forget that Brexit put considerable strain on this union, the UK union, as well as taking us out of the other one. As an official in the Cabinet Office in the coalition time, I spent a lot of my time supporting UK government ministers making the argument in the Scottish referendum campaign that the best way for Scotland to stay in the EU was to vote to stay in the UK. And self-evidently, that argument will not be available to whoever is doing that job if and when there's another Scottish referendum. Now, there's very little prospect of another independence referendum in the immediate future, but parallel with the deterioration of relationship between the UK and the EU over the last little while, there was a deterioration also in the relationship between the UK government and the governments of the devolved parts of the UK. And it seems to me that one of the big challenges for this government is to get that relationship onto a better footing, and indeed that is their expressed intent to do that. And that will mean involving the devolved governments in the debates and discussions around the negotiations on trade deals and on the EU relationship. And the reason for that is very straightforward. Although this is international relations, clearly is reserved matter to the UK Parliament, these discussions touch on a lot of devolved responsibilities, agriculture, fisheries, and all sorts of other things as well as touching on the lives of the people of Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, just as it touches on the lives of folk in England as well. So there is a real imperative, it seems to me, for the UK government to demonstrate to the people of the devolved parts of the UK that it has their interests at heart as it embarks on these negotiations. And that's not just about keeping them in touch and informed. It should also, in some circumstances, involve engaging them in the negotiations themselves. This is well precedented. I've spent many hours of my life sitting behind the Scottish Fisheries Minister in fish councils back in the day, and as part of the UK team in those negotiations. And this, as I say, is very well precedented. The thing for Whitehall, of course, it's difficult to do this because they have to understand the dynamic of devolved politics. They've got to spend more time and effort to work with officials and ministers from the devolved governments. But ultimately, the responsibility of the UK government to demonstrate that respect for the devolution settlements, for the people of Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, it is absolutely essential that Whitehall makes that effort. And this government, I think, has a real opportunity to undo some of the damage that was done over the last little while through what was seen to be huge disrespect for devolution and the devolution settlements.
And also, just adding on to that before I go to the next question to Evie, is that it is Evie, isn't it? Yes. My notice has been that the Scottish Parliament has been leading on some of the getting to carbon neutral and to leading on sustainability and green agendas because of the coalition in the previous MSP government. And I'm just wondering whether that's also something that draws on what's been going on with the EU, and therefore that can build those bridges.
The devolved governments, the Senate, the Scottish Parliament, have led on quite a lot of things over the years, smoking bans, plastic bag bans, and so on. There is, we have this tremendous sort of real-time policy experiment going on in the UK with different powers across the UK, and the learnings from that should be beneficial for policy across the piece. There's also, and something that I was sort of advocating in the Brexit time, and it never really came to much, which I think was a pity, was that there is involving the devolved governments in these sorts of discussions, informal and formal, adds another string to the UK government bow, if you like, because there are these relationships that the devolved governments have with counterparts in the EU, and those relationships can help to improve the mood music, to move debates forward. And on something like fisheries, come back to fish, always come back to fish.
Favourite.
Clearly, the majority of landings of fish in UK waters landed into Scotland. It is a proportionately more important industry in Scotland than it is elsewhere in the UK, and so it would be perverse in a way not to have that very close engagement over matters like that. As I say, it's difficult because an SNP-led government in Scotland isn't necessarily going to do any favours to a Labour-led government at Westminster. But that's where the UK government responsible for the whole of the UK has to ride above the political stramash, to use a good Scottish word, in order to advance the interests of all of the people of the UK.
Thank you. And then Evie, what role does the EU play in broader UK foreign policy objectives? Big question.
Big question. With the first challenge being what is the UK's foreign policy objectives, which is one I don't even necessarily think the UK yet has its answer to. But I think in general we've heard a lot from David Lammy about progressive realism and this idea that the UK wants to be you can't not force for good in the world because that's the last term, but force for good in the world, but doing so through kind of rational means, i.e., we'll work with a wide variety of partners if we think it will achieve progressive ends. So the question then is whether, working with the EU brings us closer to that. In many ways it does, in that the EU shares a lot of values with the UK. And then particularly at a time when you've got kind of the US withdrawing from a lot of those values, finding those friends and partners that can be on the world stage with us, speaking to those is really good. There's also a question around, our soft power, the UK's soft power, particularly in sort of places like Asia and Africa, took a big hit post-Brexit. I'm always surprised when you go to Asia how many of them know that the UK left the EU, and they ask you about it several years on now. And that's kind of a key question for them. So seeing that relationship rebuild, I think, is positive for some of those relationships, and also for our ability to lead, particularly when it comes to kind of defense and European security. So lots of positives in that sense. I think some of the challenges are obviously that if you're trying to move closer to the EU, that limits your attention towards other nations and your flexibility towards particularly trade in other nations like the Indo-Pacific. So there's always that kind of balancing act where if you're trying to kind of win lots of varieties of friends, ultimately, if you're picking and choosing, it becomes challenging. So I think that's the kind of constant thing in our minds. But in general, I think the kind of key thing is that soft power, our ability to lead, particularly at a time in a kind of difficult geopolitical turbulence.
Thank you. Back to the chair.
Thank you. So we've gone nearly an hour, and I think there's perhaps only been one mention of Donald Trump, which is quite an achievement given the context of what we're talking about. But Jeff, I think you might be about to change that with your question. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Chair. It's always good to start with an accusatory blessing. May you live in interesting times. I think the reality of where we're at is certainly a starting point. I'd appreciate a short conversation on UK-EU relations and how people think this could help restore or undermine mutual trust. Evie, could I start with you, please, given your previous remarks?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the positive is that it makes the need for the UK and the EU to work together very clear and opportune. And the more we work together, I think the more you build trust. So that's on the positive side. The challenging side, I think, is that ultimately Trump's actions don't, remove any of the existing blocks to closer collaboration that have already existed. So, for example, if you talk about fisheries, so it's still the case that the public is nervous about migration, etc. So those challenges doesn't help trust, particularly in those circumstances. And also, the kind of underlying thing that Trump is doing is less about, trust just in the US. It's about trust overall in the global system, and all upholding, for example, on how the public are feeling in the world at the moment. They're feeling increasingly nervous, increasingly scared. I'm sure it's the same for many politicians and leaders who therefore, are increasingly thinking inwards. They're not thinking about partnership, and they're feeling much more nervous about traditional partners. Inherently, the UK has trusted the United States for a very long time. And at the moment, that's kind of backfiring. And there is therefore a nervousness around a lot of these relationships, which I think will be filtered underneath kind of an undertone of discontent, which I think undermines that mutual trust at a time where we need it most. So in some ways good in that it pushes us together, in other ways challenging because of those kind of psychological undertones around trust that are going on at the moment.
Psychological undertones. Philip, would you like to comment on where we go from here?
Yeah, I mean, this is the question of the day, isn't it? This is absolutely huge. Just sort of looking backwards, if you'd indulge me for a moment, of course, this wasn't in the Brexit playbook, was it? If you go back to 2016 and in the aftermath, the big hope was that leaving the EU, the UK would do a substantial trade deal with the US, and that would be reorientate our economy from a sclerotic EU to the sort of dynamic economy of the US and beyond that to Asia and so on. And I think, if I may, I say this is a bit self-indulgent, but it sort of illustrates the very short-sighted geopolitical thinking that underpinned that prognosis. Because lo and behold, not many years have gone by, and we're in a situation where this trusted partnership with the US is now looking very ragged. The commitment to the international order, to the international rule of law, to an open trading environment, all of this being shredded in real time. When we look over our shoulder back to the EU, what do we have? We have a creature of law, abides by its international obligations by and large, maybe slow and bureaucratic, but is predictable, and you can negotiate with the EU and know that they will stick to the outcome of that negotiation. So this has changed the world dramatically. And you can see, I think Prime Minister Starmer, I think, to give him his credit, has played this pretty well so far in trying to walk this line between the EU and the US. And the UK government will be desperately hoping that it never has to make invidious choices between its long-standing, such an important relationship with the US and its relationship with the EU. But if push comes to shove, which way do we go? And I think that's a question at some point we may well have to confront. Now, my personal view on this, if you look at where the UK's long-term strategic interests lie in trade, security, and defence, they lie with our near abroad, i.e. with the EU. And if these challenges come, if we're pushed to having to choose, which is conceivable, between the trade relationship we might have with the US and sticking with the trade and cooperation agreement, which way do we go? And I think if any politicians who and leaders in the UK looking at the long-term strategic interests of this country, it seems to me clear that this should reinforce our ties with the EU, because that's ultimately where our long-term interests as a country lie.
Thank you very much, Philip. Ambassador Berger, we're just having a chat about the Trump effect. Do we push or do we pull? And who do we push and who do we pull?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And as you mentioned at the beginning, we are living in interesting times. I think we all would prefer to have less interesting and more stable times. No, I agree with what has been said, that the Prime Minister, I think, has managed this relationship very well, also on defense and foreign policy, engaging the Trump administration, trying together with France and Germany, Poland and others, putting something on the table for the negotiations. If we look at the figures, I think the trade of the United Kingdom with the European Union is more than double of the size of trade with the United States, but we obviously understand that the United Kingdom and the government is trying to maintain a good relationship in all directions, and that they will be very careful not to do anything that would limit the possibilities in the other direction. So if I can take as example the agri-food sector, we know from our EU negotiations many years ago with the US that they wanted to have access for genetically manipulated food, or the famous chlorine chicken, which where we said in the EU that this will not happen. So there are areas where we, I think, should avoid that things are exclusive or exclude then other kinds of agreements. So I must say, full understanding from our side and support for the way the Prime Minister has been managing this relationship. And in the end, you know, it will, what we will have to see is, after this 90-day period where Trump has paused his tariffs, some of his main tariffs, if there is a willingness in this 90 days to negotiate acceptable outcomes. But both our governments, I think, have the common interest in preserving the internationally rules-based order, the multilateral order. And so we have a very, very strong common interest to engage the US. And we do this in even if it's independently, but we do this with a common understanding. And Ms. von der Leyen is here today for the Economic Energy Security Conference, and I'm sure they will also talk about this topic.
Thank you, Ambassador. I think there is a cup of tea planned this afternoon. Times they are to change. Back to you, Chair. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Jeff. Alison, over to you, please.
Thank you. We saw some really interesting polling from Best for Britain recently, talking to the UK public. One of the things that it drew out is over a third of the public feel that the government's plans for resetting the relationship with Europe don't go far enough. So I'm really interested to hear from Evie and then Philip on whether you agree with this. Do you think the UK has been bold enough on EU relations?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, actually. So I think there are two strands to it. One is the question of boldness. It depends on how much realistically you think the government could do. And so whilst, as you say, polling it's pretty positive, and generally people are much more supportive of the EU than they have been, I always try and put myself in the mindset of the current government, who we know are already planning for the next election, where realistically they're thinking it's Labour versus Reform rather than Labour versus Tories. And whilst Reform voters, a lot of them have softened on the EU compared to kind of the last 5 years, they are instinctively sceptical of close collaboration. And I think, you know, the government is very cautious of anything they think will be particularly politically toxic that will make it harder to do other stuff that they would, you know, particularly like to do. So I think within the rounds of what they, you know, were the limits of what they think they can do politically, I can see where they've got to. And I think the second key thing is thinking about what areas the UK can afford to be bolder in, particularly in the light of public opinion. So, for example, not to say that some areas of policy are less interesting than others, but some are less likely to get, you know, big political headlines. So, for example, chemicals. The average person in the British public is not thinking about chemicals. Closer collaboration between, you know, the UK and the EU is much easier to get there in terms of political salience and not getting the headlines. Avoiding issues like fishing and migration. Now, obviously, for the EU, there are topics that are actually very important, so we can't avoid them completely, but finding those areas where collaboration is more feasible on a political level, I think will allow us to be less bold in terms of, oh great, the relationships reset here, public, how wonderful is that, but does mean that we can get some of that kind of concrete collaboration which will be mutually beneficial to the UK and the EU. So I think there are opportunities there which kind of are less risky ultimately in terms of the politics of it, which means that in the long term, you can continue to strengthen the relationship if that's kind of what you want to do.
Great, really interesting. Thank you. Philip?
Yes, I agree with Evie. I think the Labour government hasn't been particularly bold. It wasn't bold in the run-up to the election, hasn't been that bold since. And I think there are good political reasons for that. And I think slightly reluctantly, I think they're probably right not to be bold. It was not the time to sort of seek to relitigate Brexit. I don't think the public's ready for that. I think people think, oh God, Brexit's been done, without really understanding the impact of Brexit rolls out over decades. It's not just here and, done and dusted. So I think there was a realism about the approach the government has taken, which I understand, but it can't just stay there. The political class, the politicians in the room, has to start to move this debate forward. I'll just give you one illustration of that. One of the big topics of debate is dynamic alignment, not just on food and drink, but more broadly across different industrial sectors. Evie's mentioned chemicals. Go for dynamic alignment, that removes potentially substantial burdens of having a double conformity assessment, all the rest of it from UK industry. Good thing economically. But where does that leave the UK in terms of its influence over the standards that have been set by the EU? We're not in the single market. We're not in the clearly not members. We don't get a say in the way those regulations are developed. This is a very uncomfortable place to be for any government. And so it seems to me that it would be wise for the political class generally that's thinking sort of sensibly about this stuff to begin to move into the space of reconceiving what the relationship between the UK and the EU might look like over time. We're not going to go back into the EU anytime soon. I think that's absolutely clear. But where should we be aspiring to be, say, in 10 years' time? And I think there is plenty of scope there for a closer relationship, which allows the UK greater say over some of the regulations that it would be taking. But that would be a big, complex negotiation at the end of the day, and it's a long and rocky path towards that. But the sooner we set off down that path with a deliberate intent to find a better relationship than the trade and cooperation agreement, which was frankly the thinnest sort of deal that we could have done. People tend to forget that. The sooner we set off down that path, the better. That's where I think ultimately the boldness will lie. It's reconceiving what this relationship with our most important, as the ambassador said, most important trading partner, but also clearly our most important defence and security partner as well.
Yeah, and you're not seeing signs of that long-term vision yet.
You tell me if I'm missing it. I personally am not seeing that debate. We're still, we're still a little bit stuck in the sort of the Brexit aftermath. With any move towards the EU, it's sort of reneging on the Brexit consensus or the deal that was meant to have been, and so we're still jammed in that very binary sort of debate. And ultimately, it's for the politicians to begin to lead us out of that binary debate into something that is more fruitful and that is very securely based in what is in the long-term best interest of this country. As I say, where we are at the moment is uncomfortable and will, I think, continue to feel very uncomfortable because of the nature of the relationship that Brexit has, in a sense, forced us into. And it's seeking a way out of that, I think, is where the long-term interests lie.
Thank you, Philip. Alison, I'm really sorry to cut across, but I'm conscious of time. We've got two more questions to make sure we make him before 12. John, can I hand it over to you next, please?
Yes, thank you. I'm John Clark. Hello, I'm a recent member of this Trade and Business Commission. I'm a former European Commission trade negotiator, and I was also, a long time ago, the EU ambassador to the WTO and the UN in Geneva. I have a couple of questions to each of the three witnesses. First question, Ambassador Berger earlier in the session suggested that the summit will to a large extent be the sort of starting point or the launch pad for various negotiations. Apart from that, however, are there any specific deliverables or policy announcements or decisions that could come out of the summit in order to signal sort of very concrete progress in the EU-UK relationship? And my second question, what if any, do you see as the risks or obstacles that could impede, could affect progress at the summit? Are there any black swans, if you like, that could a good summit outcome. Maybe Miss Aspinall could start, and then Mr. Rycroft, and then Ambassador Berger with those questions. Thank you.
Absolutely. So for me, first and foremost, success is whether we get a defence pact. I think that's the most important thing for the summit. And crucially, how broad that defence pact is, what's included in it. I think we've talked a lot about having one, but actually kind of the devil is always in the detail. And not least with defence and security, you can take a very broad definition of security, which allows you to kind of encompass quite a lot of stuff, or it can be very narrow. And I think that's a key. But then secondly then is kind of questions about whether we get, in this kind of outline of the forward-looking plan, what's included in that, and crucially, how likely the prospects of success of some of those are, but particularly around youth mobility, SPS, carbon emissions, trafficking. I think they're the areas we're particularly looking for, clear directions of travel. We're not going to get big announcements, I don't think, on any of them, maybe trafficking, but actually where's the direction of travel? And to me, the biggest risk is that we get bogged down in trying to do too much, and then we don't get anything done. And so for me, getting the defense stuff sorted first, and then getting on to everything else, I think to me is the key.
Mr. Rycroft?
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I think that's very clear. The detail matters, of course, but what matters more is the sort of the mood music coming out of this. I think that the negotiations on both sides demonstrated claiming a big success. This has re-established a way of working between the UK and the EU, which is appropriate. It's set fair for continuing development of these discussions over time, but there is substance in there, particularly as Evie has said, on defence. I think the biggest risk is that as we've discussed already, sort of trying to overload the package, but I suspect that will have been well mitigated by now through the whole Sherpa process, sort of winnowing out, as you'll be very familiar with, winnowing out the stuff that isn't going to work. That's their job. So I hope we go into this with a well-prepared set of dossiers which will allow that positive outcome.
Thanks. Ambassador Berger?
Yes, John, and Philip is right. I mean, we have this Sherpa process, which is not public, and I think it's very important that we have it in order to get a better understanding of the mutual objectives. And as I said before, we would like to see progress, and maybe as a deliverable, the Security and Defence Pact, even if it would not cover all the questions of industrial cooperation. But the fact that we could have at the 19th of May such a partnership, I think would send such an important message. I'm not concerned about, I share the argument that there is a risk of overburdening, but I don't see that right now. I think with the topics we have on the table, they are all important. I think we can all argue them and explain them to public opinion where the advantages of a cooperation lie. So I must say I'm pretty optimistic. I don't see bigger risks, and especially not in the current political circumstances. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure that this Reset Summit will not only be about our joint communique and the agenda, but it will also be, and you have been ambassador in Geneva and WTO, about maintaining the international order, about our engagement in the World Trade Organization, the future of world trade, of a rules-based trade. So there are many, many topics, I think, beyond the agenda we have just been discussing, that will be on the table. And what I said at the beginning, I think it's also important to understand. We will have this process, the implementation then, and the negotiation on these topics. But then very soon we will have a discussion on the review of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement for 2026. And as I said, our hope in Germany, but I know it's shared by many in the European Union, is that through this process, we can create a dynamic of cooperation and gather more and get even more public support for what we are doing.
Many thanks. Back to the chairman. Thank you.
Thank you. So Simon Hughes has our last question. Simon, I want you to know that we don't have a hard stop in 1 minute. We want to make sure you do this justice. So over to you.
Andrew, thank you very much. And I come to this not just as a long-time former parliamentarian, but now engaged in business and from my perspective as a university chancellor in London. So thank you all very much. It's really a wrap-up question. Within a month from today, we'll know the answer to this question. What would constitute meaningful success at the summit, first summit from this new government here with the EU, both symbolically, which may be what the public notices most, and substantively, which is the building block for the future. And perhaps if I could ask in order, if Ambassador, you could respond first, and then Evie, and then Philip wrap up for us. So it's a sort of what will be the stars in the sky that we can look to as a positive out from the summit?
Yeah, I think the fact that this Reset Summit happens now on the 19th of May is a positive step in itself. As I said, we will have then a joint agenda. We will have, I'm sure, we will jointly address the international challenges. And as I said, my hope is that we can have as a deliverable a security and defense partnership agreement to show and underline the importance of the security and defense cooperation just now when we are really in maybe the last phase of a negotiation on a possible ceasefire in Ukraine and before the NATO summit.
And I think I'd go for, it's a bit vague, but just that, like concrete action, something that we can point to. I feel like we've had lots of really good momentum of kind of warm words over the last year. That's great. What's next? What's the plan? I think the defense pact will be the big thing that we can point to afterwards. But also kind of that outline of future cooperation, making sure it has a concrete plan for the way forwards. So it's not just, oh, this is all very nice, shaking hands. What's the next step? And that concrete action will be good to see. And I think we'll get it. So that's positive.
Yes, I again haven't much to add to those two perorations. I think I absolutely agree with what both the Ambassador and Evie has said. I think coming out of this, the sentiment that I would like to feel coming out of it, this is a reset of the relationship. There is hard-edged practical outcomes to this that demonstrate the value of the relationship, but it is also an earnest of intent for the future. It's the UK resuming its responsibilities as a European nation, doing so at a time of unprecedented international upheaval, but doing so committed to the rule of law, to an open trading environment, and seeking to work closely with the EU and our European neighbours to achieve that. So high hopes for it, but I think those hopes are justified, and it should set us fair for the continued improvement of this relationship over the years to come.
Thank you all very much. Really appreciated. And Andrew, back to you to wrap us up and send us our way optimistically.
Absolutely. Challenge accepted. Well, look, first of all, I want to thank all of our commissioners. As always, great questions and a really high quality conversation. And then most importantly to our three guests today, Ambassador Berger, Philip and Evie. That was a brilliant 90 minutes of discussion. I think we could have gone on much longer given the quality of the insights and the conversation. Very brief wind up from me. What did we talk about? Consensus that we are living in a new geopolitical context, that defence partnership and agreement is very likely to be the centrepiece of what we see announced on the 19th of May. But in the words of Philip, high hopes on other areas as well, including trade. And I know that UKTBC will be convening another one of these sessions soon, probably after the summit, so we can assess and evaluate what's been done. But thank you all again for joining us, and see you soon.